So if you've been around me much, you know that I'm very interested in how the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule applies to the piano. The 80-20 rule just being the idea that in any given system, about 80% of the output comes from about 20% of the input. So in practical terms, that means like 20% of your friends make up 80% of your social interactions, or that maybe 20% of your bills make up 80% of your expenditures. In business, we say that 20% of your marketing efforts creates 80% of your new customers. And it's not a perfect rule, obviously, but it's a good framework for thinking about systems and problems that you're trying to solve. So as a piano teacher, what I'm interested in is how can I get students to 80% mastery with 20% of the effort? Because there's this grave misconception that playing the piano is a thing. But it's not. I mean, we say that someone can play the piano. We use the term, but it doesn't really mean anything, in the same way that we say that people are fluent in English, but that doesn't really mean anything either. We all have our own little segments of the language that we know and use. And it's probably true that about 80% of the words that we use come from about 20% of our vocabulary. So that means that when we talk about being fluent in English, what we really mean is that you share the same tiny little set of words that we all know and use. And then the other 80% of words that you know really are not shared with other groups. For example, I don't really know many pop culture references except what my students bring in their lessons. But, you know, for me, like I know what a saxophone ligature is, or a piano whipping, or a guitar bridge. And these are probably terms that people who are more fluent in the language, like doctors or lawyers, probably don't even know what those are. And everybody is this way. And that's the important part, is that if you're wanting to learn a new language, you should really focus on this small set of words that are going to make you the most fluent the quickest. Unfortunately, most piano methods are not set up this way. They are set up to make you a well-rounded musician, which just means that you're going to be learning a lot of things that you're probably never going to use, and you're going to be learning them slowly. So when I get a new student, unless they're specifically asking for a traditional piano method, because that makes a lot of people feel really safe and that they know that they're not going to be missing out on anything, although I think they're missing out on a lot of fun really early on. Unless they're specifically asking for that, then I usually am spending a lot of time up front trying to find out what they're envisioning themselves doing. What does it look like to you when you are 10 years down the road and you are a good musician? What is it that you're doing? Where are you doing it? Specifically, are you playing Christmas carols with your family at the Christmas party? Or are you playing by yourself in your room? Are you reading classical music? Are you playing classical songs? Or are you just jamming out to your favorite rock tunes and playing along with the radio? Or do you want to be able to, when you hear something on the radio, kind of know what it is so you can go to a piano and play it immediately? And of course, the answer for everyone is, yeah, those all sound great. I need to know what is it specifically that, so I try to leave it somewhat open-ended, but have students give me the vision of what they're looking for. And I've come up with a handful of, here are the skills, here are the things that we could study. We're probably not going to study all of them, but you can study 1 or 2 or 5 of them at a time and get you more quickly to the goals that turn you into the musician you imagine yourself being. And it's a given for me as the teacher that this path will change as we go. So we'll head down the path of reading sheet music, and you'll get distracted by, oh yeah, but I really wish that I could do this chord thing over here, and we'll change and do that. But at least being aware that we're not going to cover music as if music is one thing, but that we're going to set off on a path, and that detours are allowed along the way. At least allows us to get to the kinds of things that are most interesting the earliest on. And one more thing before we get to the list. There are musicians who have made entire careers out of just one of these things. So they're not all equally necessary or not even really show up in real life. There are people who, I get students all the time who come in just for the thing that they've been missing. They've been playing piano for 20 years and they don't know how to read music at all, and they wish that they could. And so we just focus on that. Or the opposite happens a lot too, where students come in and they've been taught the traditional method and never got any kind of improvisation or ear training at all. And so they come in, they're like, well, I can't play a single note on the piano unless I've got the sheet music in front of me. How do I just make up stuff? So not only can you change this path along the way? But you can be extremely narrowly focused and enjoy that one thing for a long time, and maybe even make money at just doing that one thing without really any knowledge of the rest of it. Now, every teacher has their favorite things that they really like to teach. Anyone who says that they don't have those, I'd be wary about their teaching. But mine is probably music theory, like how things are put together, why things sound the way that they sound, or more importantly, when you hear a particular thing, what are the elements that made that kind of thing? If we think of this like a recipe, like there are people who can just like taste a dish and they know what the ingredients are. In my mind, that's what music theory is it's an analysis of the music that is out there and what makes all of that up. And then the ear training that would go along with that, which is the ability to just sit down and play what you hear. It's actually more being able to analyze the things that you're hearing so that you are able to go recreate those things. So, for example, if I hear something like that, on paper, that would be, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 individual things to memorize. And for me, it's just a C and a 2. And if I can remember C2, then that represents that whole thing. So when I'm listening, if I hear that, I go, okay, C2, and then what? Instead of having to memorize, okay, that note, and then that note, and then that note, and that note. So makes memorizing what I'm hearing a lot more condensed. So that's ear training. A lot of people think that that's just like an innate skill, or that is the sign of a really good player or a good talented musician, is the ability to just sit down and play what you hear. I mean, sure, some people are maybe born more naturally with that ability, but it's something that anyone can learn. Just like any other talent, there can be, talented basketball players. But if you practice, you can get really, really, really good at it. So ear training and theory are probably my 2 most fun things to teach. Out of all the things on this list, there's only one that I really require all of my students to do, and that is practical playing. So playing a song, and I don't care what style it is, if you want to do classical or jazz or pop or rock or new age, but you need to be working on something that is going to sound like something. If you're here to do something other than play songs or to play music, or even if you're just improvising, the style in which you improvise, if you're not actually making music, but you're just wanting to focus on exclusively exercises and drills and talk about music, but not actually playing anything that sounds like music, I don't know what we're doing here. I'm definitely not the right teacher. There are teachers who can do that, who can just spend lesson after lesson working on drills with their students. But for me, that's really should be one of the ingredients of this thing that we're doing here, which is hopefully making music, at least in my mind. So the rest of the list in no particular order. The next thing would be composition or songwriting. So of course this has a lot to do with analyzing other songs and finding out what parts get put together in what ways to create what kinds of atmospheres. So when you go to write your song, if you decide you want to write a sad song, or you want to create some kind of mood, that you have the tools to be able to create the moods that you are feeling need to be expressed. This can either be applied to an instrument or be completely in theory. So there are lots of people who don't play any instruments at all, but they still write songs because they have enough of this background knowledge of how songs should be put together and what kinds of melodies and harmonies make different types of moods. And this is a thing I think most people have more of an innate ability than they think they do, because like most kids make up their own songs anyway. I would almost say all kids make up their own songs anyway. So like that's just like creating sounds in a particular order, in a pleasing order, is I think a kind of a normal thing for our species. It's just that when we study how to put things together, we can do it more effectively and more efficiently, so we can get these concepts out of us in the same way that we study language, so that we can express ourselves more clearly and more effectively get the pictures that are in our heads into somebody else's head. Another thing you can study is technique. So this, again, it can be put all through all the other things. Anytime you're playing, you should be trying to avoid terrible habits, but most habits can get broken. And there are some incredible players who have just horrendous horrendous habits, horrendous technique, and they're still making it as great musicians, better than me in a lot of cases. So technique is a thing that you can start. Unfortunately, this is where like a lot of piano books start. You go to the music store and open up the first page of like the kids beginner piano book, and they'll like have a diagram of a hand and like what shape the hand is supposed to be and what posture you're supposed to have at the piano and how high the bench is. Like, we haven't even played a note yet. Like, for goodness sake, press a button and hear a sound. There are notes inside of this thing that want to come out. So yeah, all of the technique stuff tends to be front loaded on most traditional piano courses. I find it sad, but I'm sure there are other teachers out there who feel the same way about my method. Then there's also vocabulary. So just like any other profession or any other interest area, any other hobby, there's sets of words that mean specific things on the piano or in music. So you can spend some time just learning the vocabulary of music. Again, it seems kind of front-loaded in a lot of technique or in a lot of traditional books. Not as much as the technique stuff, but they'll like, in page 2, they'll teach you what like forte means or what a crescendo is. And again, like, we're not even like playing the notes yet. It's just like, here's a dot on a page, here's the label for the note, here's the way that you're supposed to play that note, and here's the shape that your body's supposed to make when you're playing that note. We haven't even played the note yet. So there's definitely a way to overemphasize vocabulary, but eventually it'll all come up anyway. This is something I generally don't focus on a whole lot with my students, because as they run into that stuff in the real world, it's like, oh, well, what does this mean? I'll tell them, and then they know it forever, and we didn't have to spend a whole lot of time working on it. But some students care very much about it, and they want to learn a large vocabulary at the beginning so they feel like they're knowledgeable about the subject. Now, another thing you can study is music theory. And this really has a couple different aspects to it. One is tonality. So this is the way that you use different groups of notes. We call them scales or modes, keys, and each one of them has a slightly different flavor. It creates a different mood. So you can study within theory just tonality. You can also study time and rhythms and time relationships, like literally time relationships between notes. So Wynton Marsalis says that music is just two notes in relationship to each other. So this is not music, this is not music. But if I put them in relationship to each other, or now I'm starting to create music because I put two sounds out there and I've given them some kind of a relationship. And a lot of music, probably more than people give music credit for, a lot of it has just to do with the rhythms, the amount of time that goes between one note and another. So there's a lot to be learned and studied when we're just talking about the relationship of rhythms and time and how time affects music. The notes are really the least important part of music in most cases. I think that's true. So, for example, if I play for you something like this. Like, these are all the correct notes to a song that you definitely know. And after I tell you what it is, you can go back and listen and go, oh yeah, I guess technically that was the song. So that's all the right notes with the wrong rhythms. Now here's all of the wrong notes. I'm going to completely mess up all of the notes 100%, but I'm going to get the right rhythm, and you'll probably know what the song is. It's the same exact song. Okay, so obviously I'm not playing a song at all. I'm just playing the rhythms of a song and kind of approximating somewhere on the piano, smashing down all the wrong notes, but that was obviously Happy Birthday. The first one was more correct. It was all of the right notes. The second one was just the right rhythm. So much about music is the way that it feels and not really the way that it sounds, meaning the actual frequencies of the notes. So the theory of time and relationship between notes really has more to do with like the gut feeling that you get about something that like just moves your soul. In a lot of cases, that just has to do with the rhythms and doesn't really have to do with pressing down the right keys at all. Now, another thing you could work on is playing chords. So this is playing chords, studying chords. There's no way to play a chord. But the relationships between, the same way that, like, you know, these two notes interact, these could interact in a lot of different scenes, a lot of different contexts. Those contexts are chords. So if I play this, if I go... Now, same two notes here, but I've created kind of a different scene behind it than what you were probably hearing on your own. Or we could go something like, ooh, so this is an entirely different feel. Same exact notes, maybe even the same timing. And it's just two notes back and forth, but the context behind those notes really sets it up to be very, very different moods and different flavors. So we can study what chords do those kinds of things, what relationships between chords do those kinds of things, and then, of course, how to actually execute and how to play those chords, which then kind of starts to bump into some of the other stuff. You might accidentally learn along the way some sight reading stuff or some theory of time and rhythm, and you're definitely going to be picking up a lot of vocabulary and stuff along the way. So all these things can relate to each other. And studying just the melodies, just the intervals between the notes, just the relationship between two notes, that is also its own thing. So if instead of this right here, when I was like, this doesn't sound wrong, but it doesn't sound very gutsy. I could make something that was kind of pretty. So this all kind of sounds pretty because I'm using notes in a way, in relationships that all kind of sound pretty together. Or we could play this exact same thing and make it sound a lot more gutsy. So like all of that is just different notes here. I'm playing the exact same thing down here, but it's definitely not as nice and pretty as the first one, and it's not quite as soothing as the second one. So the notes that you pick and the relationships between the notes are what determine perhaps what the most prominent, the most noticeable feeling is from a song. Now, the next one seems to be everybody's favorite to request, but probably doesn't mean as much as everybody thinks it does, and that is sight reading. Now, I'm going to compare this once again to learning a language. If we take a look at the way that you learned your first language, you were very fluent before you even knew what the letters were, or the concept that a letter represented a sound and that we could string these letters together to represent word. All of that stuff. That was nowhere near your mind when you were putting together full sentences and speaking to other humans to convey ideas. Now, I would not advocate for any musician not learning how to read music any more than I would advocate for illiteracy in society. However, it's not everything, and getting these in the wrong order, I think, is what causes a lot of students to hate piano, in the same way that getting them in the wrong order seems to be why a lot of people hate school, because you're going there and instead of being excited about exploring the world, it's a forced focus on the formula. So all of my kids are going to learn how to read books, and all of my students will probably, unless they really don't want to, learn how to read sheet music. But to say that that is like the purpose, or that's what makes a good communicator, is someone who can spell. No. In fact, probably the opposite is true. The people who are the best at spelling are maybe the worst communicators that there are out there. And a lot of times, the really most compelling, entertaining, fascinating storytellers are the ones who don't use the language properly, whether that's on purpose or whether it's out of ignorance. They're just not constrained by the rules of getting every syllable right. And I'm not saying that if you learn how to read sheet music that will make you a worse musician, but I think an overemphasis on the technical sides of the right ways, the rules of making music can definitely numb the soul and dampen creativity. On the other hand, if you don't learn how to read books, then that's like probably the most efficient way of getting cool, great stories into your head. So if you really want to become a great storyteller, probably the fastest way to do that is go read a lot of really great stories. So it can have a wonderful, positive effect on your ability to tell stories. Your ability to play the piano will be greatly enhanced by your ability to read music, but not for all of the reasons I think that people expect. They want to be able to read music because they want to be able to play anything, and those two just don't equate. Now, one thing I do like about most traditional piano methods is that they seem to do an appropriate job, in my opinion, of incorporating classical repertoire. So you will frequently, before even the first book is out, you will at least be doing some simple version of some classic piece of classical music. So as you become a more and more advanced musician, there are things that the world expects you to be able to play. You have to be able to play Canon in D and Fur-Elise and Moonlight Sonata and all the ones that everybody knows, because those are the ones that are going to get called for all of your wedding gigs. But also because it just enhances, and this might just be an old guy perspective, but it seems to enhance your perspective on the rest of music if you've been forced to at least try some of that. So like in our family, you can't reject a food unless you at least take a bite of it just to taste it and see if maybe it's not as terrible as you thought. So I think that's important in class, in most people's training, is to have some little taste of classical music. Unfortunately, one thing they leave out a whole lot is jazz repertoire. You just can't find any jazz tunes at all in traditional books, except they'll probably throw in When the Saints Go Marching in book 2. But other than that, you're really not going to run into too much jazz in those books, except they will have things with jazz-like titles. Like they'll have the Pumpkin Boogie or something, and you'll play like, or something like that. And so they put in titles as if they're teaching you a different style, but it's not really a different style. You're not really learning the great jazz classics in the same way that you would learn the classics of classical music. And I think this is a really important point for anyone who would then dip their toe in the jazz world, because it's really a very thick and rich culture that you don't really see on the surface. But once you get into it, like, there are tunes that you need to be able to know from the first couple notes of them, or jazz musicians often quote other songs, like pull out little phrases of other songs. So there's all kind of like inside jokes and terminology musically that jazz players use all the time, and just a repertoire of songs that kind of we all know. So much so that in a lot of jazz gigs, in most casual jazz gigs, you show up not really knowing what the music is going to be, and we just call tunes, which just means that someone in the band will say, hey, let's do that one song that we all know, and everyone knows it. And so if you haven't spent a lot of time listening to jazz tunes, playing a lot of that small repertoire of common tunes that we all know, then you're really going to be left in the dust, and it's really hard to make up time once you're there and you realize, oh, there are 200 songs that I need to know really well and have listened to for the last 5 years in order to be able to kind of be in this group. I don't really think you get that in very many other genres, except for maybe like church music. If you just show up to a church, then they're probably playing, like, you know, again, 80% of the songs that they sing are going to come from about 20% of the repertoire. So if you kind of know some church tunes, like these are the songs that everyone's using right now, then you can just get there and they'll just call out some song that everybody knows. And so you just kind of have to know those songs. Same thing for jazz music. And something that gets left out surprisingly a lot in the traditional books, and there's no good reason for this, there's not like copyright reasons or anything, but classical history, like learning who these composers were, what their contributions are. Why do we care about Bach? Why do we care about Beethoven? Why do we care about Mozart? Why do we care about Pachelbel? Did any of these guys actually do anything important, or did they just have some tune that became really popular? In a lot of cases, their music wasn't even popular before they died. It was like 100 or 200 or 300 years later that someone like picked up their stuff and was like, hey, this sounds pretty cool. And then it kind of becomes popular in culture. So what was their contribution to music? Did they make a difference? And how could you tell if you were listening to a Bach versus a Beethoven? Do you even know like what the sound differences are? What does a Beethoven sound like? You know what the Eagles sound like if you listen to the Eagles. You know what a Beatles song sounds like if you listen to the Beatles. So these all have their own distinct sounds, and they've all contributed something specific to music, to their genre. And the classical composers, like, you end up having heard these terms and you've played a lot of their music but don't really know who the people are. That seems like a mistake to me, that we've missed out on that opportunity. And of course, the same goes for jazz as well, knowing all the jazz composers and the jazz musicians. Even like a lot of the musicians didn't even compose their own music. Like trying to find a song that Louis Armstrong wrote, like there are almost no songs out there that you know that Louis Armstrong wrote. However, he's probably the most important jazz musician, arguably the most musician of all time, and he doesn't even have his own music. So then why do we know Louis Armstrong? Why would we call him the most important musician if he didn't even write anything? So knowing about the different musicians and their contributions, whether they composed anything or not, and knowing what instrument they were on, you know, Louis Armstrong, did he play piano? Did he play trumpet? Play saxophone? Like how would I recognize if I was listening to something, yeah, that's Louis Armstrong versus that's Miles Davis, or that's John Coltrane, or that's Bill Evans? There are ways of just listening to a musician and knowing it, and really great jazz musicians can do that quite easily and even know what era it's from. So they'll know, oh, that was that guy from that year on that album. Just like you got crazy people who listen to all kinds of rock music that way too. Now, the last three have to do specifically with jazz, but I think they have influence in other genres as well and are important for other reasons. But I'm probably biased on this one. But the first one would be jazz soloing, so playing jazz the way a jazz player would play. So most things that most people recognize as jazzy are not really something that a jazz musician would recognize as jazzy. And that's not just because they're all pretentious jerks, but because there's a common language, a common vocabulary, musical vocabulary that soloists in jazz tend to use. And so people who are just playing jazzy things are not going to be accepted very much in that community unless they're soloing with the scales, idioms, and phrases that jazz musicians would use. Then, of course, there's playing jazz chords, which isn't really as much about the chords themselves, what notes you're playing, as much as what order they're in. So this has to do with voicing and the rhythms that you're using. So, for example, if I see a C major 7, then like that's a C major 7. But like, how would a jazz musician play a C major 7? The combination of C, E, G, B, and maybe a D in there too. Like, that's probably not the way that most jazz musicians would play it. They'd probably play something more like that would be a really common jazz voicing of it, or this would be common. That would be common. So there are ways, the order in which you put the notes, it's not just about the chords and the letters that you're playing, but the order in which you play them that is going to sound more jazzy. And then there are jazz rhythms too. So you're playing something like 1, 2, 3, 4. Like that kind of sounds jazzy, but that's not really a jazz rhythm. If you played like that would be a jazz rhythm. It's almost the exact same thing, but one of them would kind of be recognized as within the jazz community as, yeah, that's a thing, that's what we do. And the other one's like, well, like, this guy's playing a lot of right notes, but he obviously hasn't been here very long. And the last one is probably just improvisation in general, so not even specific to the jazz world, but just being able to sit down and play something without having any music in front of you and without having an idea of a song in mind. And for a lot of people, again, a lot of kids do this constantly. Most kids, I think, do this to some extent, but for adults, a lot of this has to do with just like breaking the like, but I don't know what to play. Like, show me what to play. Like, what's the right thing to play? What are the right notes to play? All of this stuff are fears, especially as adults, we kind of have to find a way around or learn to dampen, because there's a lot to just like sitting down and playing stuff within a mood, and you do kind of have to know how to do it. But you in the same way that with language, like, what are the right words to say? Ready, go. That's an insane concept. It entirely depends on who you are, what the context is, who's around, what are you trying to say, what did you want to say, what was inside of your head. Well, I don't know, I want to say the right words. But the right word, like, what is inside of your head that you're wanting to say? And the same thing is true for music. Like, if you to sit down and play something, you have to have something already that wants to get out. Otherwise, this is just a tool for expression. If you have nothing to express, then you really don't need a tool for that. You're doing all the expressing that you currently want to. So without any of the notes. So then a lot of that has to do with just like finding something to say, and that can also be trained. Like, that doesn't have to be an innate talent that you have. So just by playing other songs, you can run into things of, oh, I really like how that thing sounds. What makes that sound like that? Oh, cool, I can create that same mood over here using these other notes, stuff. So usually when we use the term improvisation, we're talking about jazz improvisation. But improvisation can really just be any genre, just making stuff up. And of course, if you get to the end of the list and you don't really like, none of that sounds interesting to you, then maybe you don't like music and you shouldn't play the piano. And maybe there's other reasons that you're wanting to learn to play the piano, of other people's expectations of you, or a image of yourself that you were hoping to fulfill or something like that. And it's entirely possible that you're just the kind of personality where like, but I want to do it the right way. And maybe a traditional lesson book is great for you, because it will tell you what to do. I can't promise that what it's telling you to do will be in any way fulfilling in the future or something that you want to do in the future, but it will tell you what to do, and you will have skills at the end. I'm not sure if they'll be usable skills, in the same way that if you just like open up the dictionary, you could start learning words, but I can't ensure that those will be words that are useful to you in your real life, because again, about 80% of the words that we use in the real world come from about 20% of the vocabulary. So it might help to focus on the things that you care about most. But whatever you decide to study out there, enjoy it. It's just music. How much damage could you do? Good luck. Have fun.